Welcome to Safe Space, where life questions are talked about from Christian perspectives. I'm Alwyn, thanks for joining us. Our topic for this episode is feminism. Now I Google, and Google defines feminism as the advocacy of women's rights on the ground of the equality of the sexes. To put it simply, feminism, well, to me at least, is a movement for female equality. Undeniably an important topic, especially with the growing concern over women's rights in the world, sexual harassment in the workplace, assault, especially with the growth of the Me Too movement, religious discrimination of women, and many other problems. With me today is Dr. Sharon Bong, Associate Professor of Gender Studies at Monash University, Malaysia. Sharon was my supervisor when I was doing my PhD, and I'm very glad to be speaking to her today. Hi, Sharon.
Hi, Alwyn.
Thanks for joining me. Okay.
Most welcome.
So let's start. So Sharon, when we say feminism, could you tell us, what are we talking about? What types of feminism are there, and how would you define feminism and so on?
Wow, this is a whole lecture series. Maybe I can start with what you Googled. And there is a lot of truth in that, that feminism is essentially the fight for gender equality. But I think your reading of that, and that is women's equality to men, that is certainly pertinent, and that has shaped the inception of feminism largely in the West. Through first wave and second wave feminism has been really a struggle in terms of attaining, women's rights on par with that of the rights accorded to men. And it's only at the later part of the whole trajectory where women of color had started to rise up to fight for their rights, because prior to that it had been a white sort of feminism, if you like. And of course, in the recent decade, it's also been a fight for sexuality rights. So that has been the morphing of feminism. Okay. Yeah, and that's really like in a nutshell.
All right.
Yeah.
So when you said first wave and second wave, is there a third or fourth wave of feminism?
Yes, with the third wave of feminist thought, you had the feminist post-colonial school of thought. So I alluded to women of color, meaning Asian women, African women, South American women coming up, and they were basically contesting the whole slogan of sisterhood is global. So they were addressing, white middle-class women, identifying as feminists, and saying that, when you talk about women's oppression, a white woman's oppression is quite different from a black woman's or a Chinese woman's expression, so to speak. So that constituted more or less the third wave of feminist thought. And along that time, with Judith Butler, who deconstructed sex and gender, that brought about questions about gender identities, sexual identities, because they're very closely integrated. And that has then led off like a spin-off, for a TV series that has led on to the queer movement, as it were, for LGBT rights.
Okay. So to jump straight into a rather controversial word that is usually associated with feminism, there's this word called, and it's even right now it's a hashtag, it's called Feminazi.
Yeah.
And we really love your understanding or your explanation of that phenomenon, and what is the feminazi and why do people use feminazi and so on and so forth.
Can you elaborate a bit more about
Okay, sure.
that? Yeah, the context.
Okay, so the word feminazi, well, at least to me, at least is the situation whereby, say, a feminist or a self-proclaimed feminist gets extremely sensitive, and tied to the word of feminazi is this word called mansplaining, which is, I think, something that's very popular now on social media. So what would be interesting to know is, as a feminist, do you think feminazis is a real phenomenon, or is that something that is concocted only by guys, or is that is that a problem that is that a problem with the feminist movement itself, or how?
I think, well, first of all, hyphenated categories, by and large, within a feminist framework, is usually seen as something that's positive, okay, because it recognizes diversity, pluralism, whether it's in terms of gender or sexuality, genders and sexualities. But the hyphen here is rather unfortunate, Feminazis, because of the second term that comes after the word feminism. And when I first came across that, it's a term that I'm not so familiar with. That's why I asked for some elaboration. Feminists have had many kinds of backlash, through the decades, right? Through the decades. But and I see this as an extension or yet another example of backlash. Why do I say it's unfortunate? The hyphen of femnazi is because obviously the connotation of Nazism is rather unfortunate. And I think when I first saw that term in your questions, I thought, okay, it's quite typical where a woman who stands up for not just her own rights but other women's rights, men's rights as well as queer rights, gets labeled in this way. And is it because of her radicalism, which is understandable because there is much social or gender injustice that elicits that sort of biblical anger, if you like, anger at social injustice. But the hyphen is really quite unfortunate because of the kind of trauma and memory that Nazism conjures, which is, I think, quite an unfair and quite misplaced label, hyphenated label. Yeah.
Perhaps to give some contemporary examples. So, for example, Piers Morgan, who is a pretty outspoken newscaster, he recently, a couple of months ago, he criticized Madonna and Emma Watson for exposing themselves and yet labeling their actions feminism. So he rejects that view of feminism, and he would believe that a more authentic feminism would be, say, the Kurdish women fighters, fighting and challenging, the might of ISIS, and he would say that people like Emma Watson and Madonna, to expose themselves to be sexually objectified like that, and yet to call themselves feminists, that would be wrong. And he would insist that the Kurdish women fighters are the true feminists. So what would be your take on that kind of comparison?
It's, I think, easy to appreciate why he would feel that, one brand of women, fighting pretty much quite literally and at the forefront of the battlefield would be proper feminism, as it were. And the sort that, Emma Watson and Madonna exemplify or embody would be, by Morgan's definition, an improper one, an improper feminism. But through the years, women in so many different social cultural contexts have had to contend with just on the question of bodily representation or gender expression, mostly men, but also women, telling them how they should wear, what they should wear. And of course, the whole debate about the hijab and things like that. So Madonna is held as a feminist icon by feminists because she challenges, precisely because, and paradoxically because she challenges such sexualization, eroticization of women's bodies, as well as that kind of abject objectification of women's bodies. Right. And it is also a statement in response to the rape culture that we find prevalent in so many of our cultures, where a woman is often blamed, and even girls, that they deserve to be raped because of what they wear. So where do we draw the line? So if a woman is fully covered, she doesn't deserve to be raped. Prostitute, the lines are more blurred. What about a girl? What about babies, who are also raped? So when individuals like Madonna and Emma Watson, who is also championed as, you know, a contemporary feminist icon today, and also for a stand on queer rights, they are responding to backlash received on these fronts. You know, they take it to the extreme to make a point that a woman's bodily integrity is basically hers. So it's really pushing the right to self-determination in terms of what you wear, and of course that's not going to go down well with many people, both men and women.
Right.
Yeah.
So, because clearly, and I admit that I struggle with this as well. Because if people like Madonna and Watson, for example, they behave in a way which, to me, appears to be self-sexual objectification, I would question the value of the feminism being being portrayed. But you recognize that that's because of the inherent biasness that is already there. Is that right?
Yes.
Would that be roughly?
Yeah. Thank you for your honesty, Alwyn. When we talk about feminism, normally we use the plural form feminisms because it's really complex. And on the question of, for instance, prostitution, or even on the question of pornography, there are two schools of feminist thought. So one would see, you know, pornography and prostitution as a violation of a woman's right.
Sure.
Okay, a violation of her bodily integrity, and it's, you know, a victimization. But there is, believe it or not, another school of feminist thought that does not view it in this way. And so they would use the term sex work, for instance, rather than prostitution, because they recognize that for many women who are not oppressed into or sold into sexual slavery, that this is a very conscious choice.
Sure.
And these are movements where, you know, you would find the call to decriminalize sex work, for instance, so that, you know, it's recognized as work. So the work in sex work is the operative term. And a similar sort of understanding, and this is a feminist framework, is also directed at pornography, for instance. So it's so subjective what constitutes pornography to one individual to the next, whether you're Christian or not.
Sure.
And so, you know, if you like, Madonna and Emma Watson are engaging in what some might see as, you know, an eroticization of their own bodies, and it is precisely because they are, you know, driving it. They are the ones, correct. It's coming from within. It's coming from them, exactly.
Right.
So it's, you know, a manifestation of their own agency. It's not as if they were coerced.
Sure.
They're not dressing in that way to please, you know, male or female partners or their general fans or their general public.
Okay.
Yeah.
So based on what you explained, I would assume that under this framework, the key aspect of feminism is the agency of women. Yeah. So whatever they choose and how they self-determine, the important point is that they have made that self-determination.
Exactly, yes.
Okay. Thanks so much. In the same vein, since we talk about rape culture and stuff like that, recently there was a case brought up against a comedian, Aziz Ansari, and it was quite controversial because his accuser, based on a story that she told to the journalist, the magazine, many people, again, including myself, would read that story and we would go like, you know, at any time you could have said no to Ansari, at any time you could have left Ansari's room, or you could have said, you know, rejected him, and yet you continue doing that. How would a feminist process this this issue? Do you think that, for example, would feminists argue that women are sexually powerless? Would feminists say that they are helpless against assault, or can a woman, you know, very strongly choose to say no against someone like Aziz Ansari?
The Me Too movement has really brought to the forefront all of these questions, right?
Sure.
And the agency or the power, the strength, the sheer courage to say no, and when should one say no, and how, you know, no means no, not no means maybe, or no means yes.
Right.
Um, I think unless one is in that position of relative powerlessness, can one appreciate how it is not always possible in the moment itself, and that moment could be, dragged out, not literally a few seconds, to summon up, the strength to say no at that point in time.
Right.
And often, frustrating as it is for the lawyers, and other activists, frustrating as it is, but I think a more compassionate view is warranted simply because of the gap, and the Me Too movement brings us out, the gap between the men who are in power and the women who were not at the time that they were sexually harassed, or at the end of being sexually violated. Yeah. And even in terms of definitions of rape laws, for instance, the more progressive or the more liberal would be to take these circumstances into account, meaning that sometimes a woman says yes because if she's held on a knife point, right? So and the whole aspect of sexual coercion, a sexual kind of terrorism, if you like, is a very real and present threat in the lives of so many. And for many, many women and girls, the violators are actually, male members of their family. And these are women and girls who have endured years of, abuse at the hands of persons whom they have entrusted, their well-being to. So it's a really murky situation. And I guess it's all too easy for, some of us to stand back and make value judgments. But I think you really have to be in the position and in the shoes of, the individual.
There is a phrase that I learned from a feminist when I was discussing with her about this case. She raised up the phrase called dubious consent. I guess that aligns quite well with what you're saying, in a sense that she was saying that some women want to say no, but they are afraid or traumatized, and they end up giving the impression that they say yes, or they just don't know. Would that be what you were talking about?
Definitely, Alwyn. I mean, a classic example is the whole concept of marital rape, for instance. And the reason why in our country it took 10 years for the domestic violence bill to be enacted was because there were religious members of the whole consultative body who couldn't deal with the whole alien concept of marital rape, because a woman is thought to have surrendered her body, agency in other words, to her husband. But the understanding is a relationship of mutuality, right? Not an abuse. But when you take that sort of protectiveness, loving care away, then what you have left is something that is much cruder. So a lot of people couldn't deal with the concept of rape in marriage. So I think dubious consent, or the lack of full informed consent, certainly maybe some people's everyday reality.
Experience.
Yeah, correct. And experience, yes.
Got questions? Connect with us. Send us a tweet or an email.